Hello, and welcome back to the 5th episode of Hello, It's Better to Talk. I'm talking about the stories behind my book, No Place to Lie, which will be out on the 4th of February this year. And today we're going to focus on my mum and the secret that she took to her grave when she died in December 2017. I have with me my husband, Tim, who knew her in the last few months of her life. And we're going to be talking a bit about the time leading up to the funeral and everything that came out after that. So stay tuned to the end of the episode when we're telling you really what came out about my mum. Hello, my name's Helen Garlick. For 35 years, I was a family lawyer and mediator, but I kept secret what was happening in my own family of origin. Now I know it's time to talk about it. So I'd like to warmly welcome you to Hello, It's Better to Talk. So to give you a bit of a background about my mum, she was born in 1931 and she was a real beauty. She was a kind of ice queen, blonde, corn hair, corn gold hair, blue eyes, a little bit icy. You never quite knew what she was thinking. She was often quite quiet. And she was the oldest one of two girls. So she had a younger sister called Judy, who was 7 years younger than her. And my mum never actually forgave her sister for having been born, nor her parents for having had a younger sister. So she would say, even in the last years of her life, I was devastated when Judy came along. So that was always a kind of tricky thing between her. But in terms of my mum, she wasn't the kind of like the usual sort of mum. She was unusual. When I was a child, she would offer, for example, to teach me how not to blush because she thought that was important. And I would be kind of going, what? So she'd say, I'm going to tell you a secret, Helen, and it's how to control yourself so that you don't blush in front of people. And I'd just be feeling quite mystified. She'd say, right, what you need to do is you have a mirror in front of yourself and then you imagine something that really makes you embarrassed and ashamed and you see the blush come up there and then you, with your will, you make the blood come down back into your body. Okay, Mum. And there's another thing which was actually particularly weird where she could make people trip over just by looking at them. That was another secret she taught me. And she said, look, I can, we could, wherever we are, if you just identify somebody and I can make them trip over by looking at them. And she did. I remember at Doncaster Market one time, we were going to the fish market and I said, well, make that man trip over, Mummy. And she just looked at him and then he tripped. I was like, oh my God. So, Mum wasn't exactly a sort of usual kind of a mum, but she and my dad were kind of quite a glamorous couple in Yorkshire. My dad was a solicitor, worked in Doncaster, and then later opened an office in Sheffield, which my mum ran his office. And they lived in a huge house later on in my teens called Slade Houghton Hall. It was built in William and Mary times. It was just an extraordinary place. I hated it because it was very, very ghostly. But they used to have big parties there. Just kind of, they were very liberal. They would let my brother and I watch Top of the Pops when none of the other parents would. They thought David Bowie was really cool. So they were unusual. But I never felt particularly close to my mum. She was always a bit of a mystery to me. I always didn't quite know what was going on. And then when back in 1981 my brother died, then it was obviously that's not the stuffing out of them and not the stuffing out of all of us as a family. So by that time they were living in Doncaster. They continued travelling a lot. They loved to travel. They used to love to go to the theatre. They set up the Doncaster Arts Centre. They were very, very arty people. But they also used to drink a lot. And in a way, the body holds the score. So over the years, as they got older, they both got dementia. My father had to go into a care home for the last 3.5 years of his life. And then my mother, from 2011 onwards, was actually on her own for the first time in her life. She was living on her own for the first time in her life. I got to know her a little bit better then. But, I mean, you met her, Tim, we met in 2016, didn't we?
Yes.
And do you remember my mum and what she was like?
Of course I remember your mum. She wasn't an easy person to get to know, though. As you said before, she was a private woman. She wasn't a woman of many words.
Mm.
And although I feel as if I got to know her a bit, there was always something about the fact that she was holding things, a secret, maybe secrets inside her. I have a picture of her sitting on a settee in the flat that you rented in London. And she was just sitting there looking down at the floor. And she would do that for minutes on end and just not communicate at all. And you looked at her and with the shoulders slumped over a bit, and you'd think she's holding on to some difficult stuff in there. And she was. Yeah. Well, that came out.
Yeah, well, it did.
Well, we knew some of it already, and then more came out later. And she was holding this stuff inside her. And, there were a lot of shadows going on. And then occasionally she would say something and her face would light up and she'd smile. And then you could see the sun come out. But then it would go back into the shadows again. And, I feel that even though I knew her for a couple of years, I didn't really know her very well.
No. I think that was a common thing. People just didn't quite know whether they knew my mum or not. I mean, obviously the tragedy of my brother's death had hit her very hard, and we knew that had happened, but we didn't know anything else at the time when you met her. We didn't know, sort of going back to 2017, then when she'd gone up the Shard, hadn't she? That had been a lifelong ambition of hers, and you were working in the Shard at that time. So she'd done that, but then she really just went downhill. She fell over several times. I went to see her on her birthday, and she was already in hospital. It was very difficult. I mean, she kept sacking the carers that I organised for her. She was quite a strong-minded woman, but eventually we had to organise some care for her. So she went into a care home on the 13th of December, 2017, and then we'd gone to the care home and we were settling her in, weren't we? Do you remember? You were kind of like bringing stuff in from the car, and she had this bunch of papers, which was her memoir. So while you were kind of bringing in the big stuff, I can remember kind of sorting things out in her desk, and Mum went to the loo. And when I was sort of putting this papers, I've just brought this out because this was just a handwritten, just her scribblings on a white envelope. And I saw this on top while she was in the loo. It said, I am and will always not be the same, but be different, not the norm. I don't understand why I'm different. It's not a talked about subject. And then Mum came out of the loo. So I just kind of put the papers away and pretended that I hadn't been looking at them. If only I had carried on reading at that point. That second, in a way, changed everything. We had no idea. No. So she died 8 days later, didn't she? We'd been to have lunch with her. She had roast lamb. Do you remember?
I did. And she ate it with great gusto.
Yeah.
I remember probably one of her last meal, perhaps.
It would have been, probably.
And then she died the next day,
much
to our astonishment.
Well, it was totally unexpected. We got a phone call at 7:00 the following morning, and she just died. And because it had happened all so quickly, then the coroner had to be called, and the coroner said eventually that she'd had a massive heart attack, and he said it would have been like a light being switched off. She wouldn't have felt a thing. So that was a shock, because it was just before Christmas, the 21st of December, the shortest day of the year, which actually isn't a surprise because my mum loved the sun. So we had to kind of organise things. The funeral we knew wasn't going to be till January. Had to go and collect everything. But it wasn't until a few days later, was it? And then I was kind of getting ready for work. I mean, it was just like a turmoil in the flat.
It was in my flat in Teddington.
Yeah.
And I remember that you were in the spare bedroom and you were standing by the window and you had that envelope in your hand.
Yeah.
And I was just walking past down the little corridor there.
Yeah.
And I looked in and you said...
Yeah, I said, because I just picked this up and I was reading it through and I said, I don't understand why I'm different. It's not a talked about subject. It's 2017 and in a little village, no one ever mentions it. And I wonder how other...
And then you went, what's
that word?
there? And I looked at it, lesbians. It does say lesbians. I mean, it sort of, for a moment, I can see why you would have not recognised that word. But
she does a funny L, doesn't she?
Clearly,
and a funny B.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And suddenly we looked at each other and then you read the rest of the envelope.
Cope. Yeah. And if I can't even read this now. If I'd been
Oh God,
like this, if I'd been asked if I was like this, then I'd always try and laugh it off. Yeah. But God has made me like this. Yeah. I know there are others, and I've had my share of others. You know, I said, what? Do you remember that we both like just
had my share of others? So we're thinking, okay,
who were likewise, and then this is such a sad word, afflicted.
Yeah,
afflicted.
Other people really, have been likewise afflicted.
Yeah.
And it's very sad to see that word.
It is.
And you realise that she didn't welcome.
No, I think so. She had obviously felt that she'd had to keep this secret all her life. And I remember you saying to me, I don't know if you remember this, but, you know, isn't it sad that she wasn't able to talk about it and find somebody...
It was that word, afflicted, and you think that, you know, this was a source of shame. It was sort of something horrible that had been, she was afflicted by.
Yeah.
And actually, nowadays, of course, you think somebody's a lesbian. You think, well, you know, good for them. That's fine. You know, but we just looked at each other, and actually, we sort of burst out laughing, didn't we?
We did. I mean, I think it was just the shock.
I think it was the shock partly, but we just sort of thought, this is crazy.
It's mad.
Suddenly, we've discovered that your mother, all this time, for like 60 years.
Well,
and the whole,
longer. I mean, so she was married to my dad for 59 years until he died in 2014. She was 86 when she died. Oh. And, you know, it was one of those things that it wasn't even that I didn't have an inkling about it. I didn't even have an inkling about it. It was just extraordinary. No. And I can remember telling my kids about it because obviously, you know, actually they had a very good relationship with my mum. But they had no idea whatsoever. So
And they thought it was cool.
They thought it was cool, didn't they? Cool, we've got a gay granny.
Yeah, they liked having a gay granny.
Yeah, I know.
I mean...
I wish she could have known. I wish she could have known how easy it would have been to come out to us. But she didn't. And so she took that secret to her grave. We decided, or at least I decided really, I must take this on myself, that not to tell my Auntie Judy, because my Auntie Judy is everything that my mother isn't. My Auntie Judy was a second-hand car dealer in Yorkshire. She learnt to fly a plane when she was 40. She was fun, giggly, extrovert. She wouldn't have been able to contain it. So we didn't say anything to her. And at the funeral, I read out that first sentence, but apart from my kids, nobody knew. We thought we'd keep it until later on. Although, bizarrely, my Auntie Judy had done a photographic display of my mum, and she'd put a title of it saying, "My Sister, the Enigma." So that was that bit of the story. And then things really started once I told Judy about it, and then we found out from Gwen, who is an old friend of my mother's, that this had been going on for years. There was so much that came out. It was like, I can't even describe it. It's like a sort of massive avalanche or storm.
Gwen was there on the envelope.
Gwen was there.
As one of the women that she'd had a relationship with.
That's right. My mum's named various people that she had relationships with. So in next week's episode, I'll be telling you about what we found out from Gwen, who, when I first contacted her, said, "Helen, I've been waiting for your call all my life. Of course, I'll answer any questions that you have. So then we started finding out. So please join me for next week's episode of Hello, It's Better to Talk. And please subscribe. I love you to subscribe. It's like I do a little happy dance every time you do. Thank you. Love and light.